Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a few minutes and to let people join the call, and then we'll get started. I see a few friendly faces in the attendees. Special hello to Betty Dura, who is a big part of this project. I think we can get started. Hello and welcome everyone to PHS Live, Building Knowledge and Breaking Barriers. We're excited to share about the collaboration between Presbyterian Historical Society and the Community College of Philadelphia today. I'm Kristen Gatos. I'm the Director of Communications here at PHS. And I'm going to introduce our panelists here who were all involved in the project. And then a little bit later in the call, you'll hear from them, and we'll also share about the kind of origins and beginnings and products that came out of this project. So today we're joined by Jenny Barr, who is the Outreach and Reference Archivist here at PHS. We're joined by David Prejsnar, who's the Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and the Coordinator of the Religious Studies program at Community College of Philadelphia. We're joined by Sonia Prescott, who is the Public Services Associate at PHS. And we're joined by Stephanie Santoro, who was a Building Knowledge and Breaking Barriers student exhibit designer and a current senior at LaSalle University, majoring in religious studies and minoring in political science. So welcome everyone. Before we turn to our panelists for a little Q&A, I just wanted to mention a few things. We're going to have a short presentation at the beginning of the session where we'll hear about the Bkbb project, and then we'll have a Q&A with our panelists. And we'll also have some time at the end of the session for any audience questions. So we ask that you hold your questions for the end of the session, and when we wrap up, you're welcome to put those questions into the chat or the Q&A, and I'll relay them to our panelists. We're being broadcast today on Facebook, and we're also recording this session, so it will appear on our website at a later date. So let me start this presentation. One second, folks. Apologies. All right. So you see here, this is the Building Knowledge and Breaking Barriers logo. Building Knowledge and Breaking Barriers was an archives-based learning project that brought educators, students, staff, and student support networks from Community College of Philadelphia together with material and staff resources of the Presbyterian Historical Society, a Philadelphia archive with over 500 years of history to explore. This project grew out of a belief that PHS could create meaningful encounters between Community College of Philadelphia students and historically resonant documents. We believed that we could build research and critical thinking skills for students in the archive. We believed that we could create that we could identify ways for PHS to assist Philadelphia students and educators more in the future. And a big goal of this project was to confront barriers to access in the archives. In 2017, PHS began working with a group of Community College of Philadelphia professors to curate primary sources into thematic sets that would be available to CCP students. That fall, the first CCP class, Joel Tannenbaum's 19th century US history class, visited the archive for an orientation visit. The orientation was followed by individual student visits to PHS to research in the collections. And that following semester, Jackie Akins brought her African American history class to PHS. Encouraged by the early classroom collaborations with CCP, PHS applied for and received a grant from Pew Center for Arts and Heritage in 2018 to continue this collaboration. There were two types of goals that we set for the Bkbb project. The first set of goals was the building knowledge goals. And these goals included building semester-long collaborations between CCP and PHS, producing theme and subject curriculum guides that would live on a Bkbb project website. And then we would help student-led research projects. We would host semester ending celebrations to celebrate student accomplishments. And we would host a student-led exhibit at the end of this project. And Jenny is raising her hand. Yeah, Jenny?
I'm raising my hand. Are you advancing the slides?
I am. Unfortunately,
okay,
that's not appearing on my screen.
We are not seeing the slides. I know.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, everyone.
Okay.
Looking at the wrong screen. So I'm going to quickly go ahead. There's Jenny and Joel. So that was the first class that came to CCP. Here we are, and I'm going to speed ahead. Sorry about that. So yeah, the building knowledge goal was really that first set of goals, and that was to host students and create products and also create a student-led exhibit. So thank you for pointing that out, Jenny. We're going to skip ahead to the next slide and spend a little more time on it. The other goal of this project was the Breaking Barriers goal, and through classroom visits to the PHS building, through internships and student-led exhibits, PHS would identify ways that we could become more welcoming to CCP students and to other Philadelphia students and their support networks. Although we successfully carried out all of the programming that we intended, one of the most persistent barriers was the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic curtailed project collaborations in shared spaces beginning in March 2020 and brought much of the work online, including the design of the student-led exhibit. From 2019 to 2021, 7 current and former CCP students worked collaboratively with 2 professional exhibitors, a project videographer, and 3 PHS staff to reveal parts of the PHS archive that meant the most to them. The BKB exhibit was installed in the spring of 2021, and for the most part of that year and for the most of 2022, the only way people could experience that exhibit was online. And we're thrilled to finally host a celebration and opening of that exhibit on October 6th in the PHS building. So this is an open house, and you can find out more about it by visiting bkbbphilly.org. Before we turn to our panelists, I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the statistics that came out of the Bkbb project. During the project, we welcomed 329 CCP students to PHS, although some of those were virtual during the pandemic. We worked with 9 different CCP classes, including American Religion History, Creative Writing classes, African American History, and Creative Writing classes. We provided 3 paid internships to CCP students, and we worked with 7 student exhibit designers to create the Bkbb exhibit. With that presentation that included a few hiccups, I will turn to our panelists to ask a few questions. So I wanted to start with a question for Dave. Dave was one of the early classroom collaborators for the Bkbb project. Dave, how did you hear about PHS, and when did you start introducing your students to the archive?
I have to remember to unmute. Thank you, Kristen. So I have to be honest and say I had never heard of the Presbyterian Historical Society before I was speaking with, and I'm not sure whether it was Joel Tannenbaum or Jackie Akins, but one of my colleagues, and they told me about the project that they had been doing with their class. So that would have been, I guess, 2017 probably, or the early part of 2018. And because I know we'll talk a little bit about this, but because I already use primary sources, documents in my classes, it seemed like a wonderful project to do. So it was probably through Joel or Jackie.
And Jenny, how did you work with Joel with Dave and other professors from CCP to identify primary sources from the PHS collections?
Thanks, Kristen. I have to say that I feel like I have the best job in this whole CCP PHS project, because I've been able to work with the instructors and with the students and a lot with the materials themselves. So I think the process of working with the instructors really just involves starting a conversation with a particular instructor about what their curriculum is, what their syllabus looks like, what are the major events and people and movements that they're covering in their class, and then thinking about whether anything in our holdings at PHS can connect with those themes and stories and people that they're talking about in the class. And it's amazing how broad the collections turn out to be here. I thought that religious studies is a natural fit for us. Of course, we can find some good materials for religious studies, but also general history, African-American history. We found a lot of things to use with English classes and architecture classes. So we've really been able to partner with professors in a lot of different disciplines, which has been really great. So I have a conversation with the instructor. What are you looking for? Are you looking for specific documents? Do we have any of those specific documents? If not, and it turns out a lot of times we don't have the particular sermon or the particular document that they would be talking about in the class, we have other things that sort of speak to the same themes or fit into the same time period or relate to the same people. And so we can often find some really great documents that will be interesting to the students. There's sort of back and forth between me or any archivist looking through our holdings and talking to the professor, is this document going to work for your class? We're looking for documents that are meaningful for the curriculum, challenging but not impossible. We've got a lot of manuscript things here that would be a big stretch for anybody to really master and use in a one semester class. And then collections, documents that are interesting and cool. Like, I want the students to be engaged by the documents, and I want them to think that the things they're looking at are special and cool, and I want them to catch the fire of, I'm looking at something from 1820 and it's really from 1820, and that can be a really great experience for someone to have in the archives. It makes them sort of understand the value of that particular document, understand why we're keeping it here. So a little searching in the archives, a little consultation with the instructor, and then we pass it over to the instructor and they use the materials in their class for whatever project they want to design for their students, whether it's a semester-long research project or a shorter assignment. And then what we've been really lucky with this program is that we've been able to work with the same professors repeatedly, so we can sort of modify and refine the sets that, the documents that we've chosen to work with. So it's a sort of iterative process, but a lot of conversation with the instructors, sort of the basic answer to that question.
Students' exposure to using primary sources in the classroom prior to the Bkbb project, and how did bringing them to PHS, how did that impact their work?
So, first of all, I should probably say a quick word about Community College of Philadelphia, although I imagine many people could kind of conclude what the institution is like. But we are a community college, a two-year college, and a large urban community college. So students do not have to take a history or a religious studies course. So usually the students in the course, and I teach and have done the project with our Religion and American History course. So it's a history and a religious studies course. And usually students have never studied primary sources. Occasionally they have, but often they don't really think about how a historian goes about the work. But for my class, going back as far as I can remember, I have had the students use primary sources, and usually it's various primary sources that I've picked up through the years that they read either in an anthology or else on our learning management system. But one of the challenges, of course, is, like Jenny said, picking the right primary sources that are, it's kind of the Goldilocks question, challenging but not too challenging. And and sometimes you have to look at things like the language, the English language. Now, usually the students read them where they were edited already for students. So they might have taken out some of the more difficult passages. They might have updated the language a little bit. And of course, they were reading it in a modern typeset format. So I think one of the wonderful things about working with PHS and archive in general is they're actually seeing the real document. They're seeing, the publication in front of them. And that, of course, presents challenges, but also gives them a sense, I think, of this is real. This is not, there's a sense maybe of the, the fact that it's tangible. And especially before the pandemic, they could actually see the document in front of them. So those are some of the, some of the things I've done. I can talk more about specifics, but definitely they were using primary sources, and usually it was the first time that they might be doing that.
Dave, you mentioned the kind of tangible quality of the primary sources, but PHS also, as part of this project, made a lot of these primary sources available digitally. So my question for Jenny is, along with the digitized primary sources that we created, what other types of sources are available on the Bkbb website? Can you share about those resources, how they were compiled, and maybe how educators can find them and use them in the classroom?
Sure. Shall I share my screen and show a couple of examples? Okay, so share screen. Let's see, that's not right. Okay, so here is the Bkbb website. And we, as Kristen said, we digitized all of the documents that we used with the classes. We grouped documents together into sets by topic or theme. And we have put them on the website in a couple of different ways. You can sort through them by the theme or topic, you can sort through them just individually by each document. And then we created a timeline where we've added them all chronologically. So if you want to go through starting with the American Revolution and going forward, then you can browse through them that way. I'm going to show you one of the source sets. And let's see. This is the source sets page. And since we've got Dave Prejsnar here, I will show you the First Great Awakening set. That was a surprisingly popular set among his students. I shouldn't be surprised by that, but I was surprised by that. So one of the really great things that we were able to do with this grant was we hired a curriculum designer, a resource, I think we called her a history resource writer. And she helped us create contextual information around the themes and the particular documents that we chose to illustrate those themes. So each set has an introductory page, and it's a pretty brief introduction. You know, you're not getting the whole story of the First Great Awakening, but enough so that you know where you are in the story, like what's the time period, who are the major people we're talking about. So there's an introductory piece. Then we have each of the documents that are part of the set, and that's primary sources and secondary sources. So instructors can have their students read passages from the primary sources and then get more understanding of the whole topic by reading some secondary sources to sort of make it all fit in together. Let's see here. We'll open one of these. Are you seeing the document there? Scrolling by on the page. Yep, okay. So this is one of the documents that we had, a pretty key sermon that everybody that, you know, if you're reading about the First Great Awakening, you'll run into this document. So we haven't scanned the whole thing, but we've scanned the key passages that the students are being recommended to read, and they can read it online here. They can expand it and see the whole thing, you know, see full screen sized view of the document. We have added transcripts. As Dave said, the original typography can be a little hard for modern students to read. It's got, you know, the long S that looks like an F, and it can be a little hard to get a handle on. So we've added links to transcripts in plain text that are a lot easier to read. We've got citation information, and then a note about the particular source that includes information about the writer of the source, a little more context again. And then one of the things that I think is really, really valuable from this project is the resource writer put together reading questions. So students have sort of a guide to what to think about as they're approaching this really old and unfamiliar piece of writing. How do I get into this? And these reading questions help the students step into it and look for particular things and think about particular questions as they're reading through. So these are all tools to help the student navigate what can be a really kind of a baffling exercise otherwise. Each of these source sets are, let's see. The source sets can then be downloaded all together in a single PDF. So instructors can, you know, take that away with them, and they can use whatever pieces of it they want that make sense for the class they're teaching. So I would encourage people who are interested to go to the bkbbphilly.org website and look at the BKBB archive, and you'll see the different topics that we've already added. The idea is for this to be a living website, and we'll keep adding more information to it. Honestly, there's not very much 20th century material on here now, but that is one of the goals, is to add more, more recent documents, and the more recent documents will have more images, which is sort of an interesting way of learning about the topics as well. So there's a lot of work that we have ahead of us with this, but it's we're hoping that it's a good resource for instructors at varying grade levels, high school, maybe junior high school, depending on the class, certainly community college and four-year institutions. We're hoping they all find this useful.
Thank you, Jenny. Just a question for Dave to wrap up our classroom portion of this broadcast. Apart from gaining experience using primary sources in the classroom, what else did students take away from their experience visiting the PHS archive?
So I think one thing they took away, which I've already mentioned, is just that sense of they're engaged in something that's not just a classroom exercise. There are a couple students who come through the project who have actually gone on and become history majors with the goal perhaps of even becoming an archivist. But I think they've taken a few other things away. One is just, first of all, to get a sense of how to tackle a long-term project. And as you do research, I think that's a skill that becomes useful in many other areas besides the one particular class. And we tried, as Jenny has talked about, I think I forget what we ended up calling them, but the contextualized sheets, the questions that you just saw have been very useful, I think, in helping the students master some of the skills that they required. But eventually they have to put the documents together. They have to try and see where they cohere and where perhaps they see cracks between the documents, so to speak. And I think that's a good skill to have in many disciplines. And the other thing I'll say very briefly is many times I've had students come back to me and said, these people at the Presbyterian Historical Society have been the most helpful, friendliest people I've ever met. So I think one thing is students are often scared to talk to librarians, and I think just working with PHS has been such a wonderful experience for so many students, because you folks are just wonderful. And you really do make people feel welcome. So if they go into a library or an archive in the future, hopefully they'll be much more comfortable.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to share. That wraps up our classroom portion of this broadcast. And now we're going to shift a little to talk about the exhibit design. So we're going to talk to Stephanie and to Sonia, who were involved. Stephanie as a student exhibit designer with the BKBB project, and Sonia, who supported the students as they researched and designed their exhibit. My first question is for Stephanie. I was just wondering, Stephanie, if you could share kind of how you first were introduced to PHS. So, what class brought you to PHS at first, and what was your experience working in archives or using primary sources or archival collections before that?
Sorry about that. So I was introduced, and thank you everybody. I thought you all were very accurate in telling me how everyone's, like, for me as a student, I share the experience that you were all alluding to. And even though I was introduced to PHS through an online course at first. So the way I came in contact with PHS is through an online history course at CCP, History 102, U.S. History on the Civil War and 19th Century with Dr. Joel Tannenbaum in, I think, 2018. So I wasn't, with that first group, but we were presented with some primary source documents and secondary source documents that we had to choose from to write our first paper. And I chose, either Sonia or Jenny probably put these source packets together, but I chose to use some that led me to write a paper on segregation within abolitionism, and using meeting minutes that were in some of those documents from abolitionist meetings in Philadelphia. I ended up writing about abolitionists who were women, both formerly enslaved women and white women, and their different experiences that I observed from reading these documents, and their different experiences with their abilities to move around and be active in the movement, and which also led me to a kind of tension that I observed with white women and their lack of awareness of their own subjugation to men, as having to start their own meetings and projects because they were excluded from those of the men working toward the cause. And my experience with using archival collections up to that point was zero experience. So, but I think that was a good entry point to start with on an online sort of introduction, because you got to see them with no other choices. In contrast, when you go into an archive, you're presented with so much information, and Dr. Joel Tannenbaum basically presented us with a couple of choices, and we had to narrow it down to one. So it was a really good experience for me as an entry point, and it exposed me to some information that I hadn't thought about before with that kind of history. So
thank you, Stephanie.
Mhm.
My next question is for Sonia. Sonia, you worked with CCP students to identify collections and stories for their exhibit installations. What process did you go through to help students identify, the inspiration for their exhibit?
Hi, so it's interesting. You would think that since I've been kind of involved with this project for a number of years now, that I would not necessarily come across any new information, but just tonight, it just hit me in hearing Jenny's description of how she worked with the teachers, of how similar that was to my experience of working with the students. In that when students first came in and sat down with me, my first thought was, if you don't have much experience with an archive, what can we do to speak to what you're interested in, as opposed to just kind of giving people, a set, or students a set amount of records? What I would say is, what are you interested in? Where do you want to start? And we'll build from there. And so that's generally how my conversations went with the students, because it was really important to me that for them to be invested in the project, that they actually deal with things that were interested to them. And so, I had, at least with one student I know with Duran, our first conversation with him, it was just kind of, well, I know you're interested in art. What can we build on from there? And so it was really just a combination of working with his thoughts about different things, what his interests were, and then, working with my understanding of what was existing in our collections and what we have in our holdings. And I just kind of built on those conversations. And, sometimes there were points where students would say that their interest was X, and I would have to say, okay, we don't have any X. X does not exist here, but we can get you Y. How does that work? And sometimes that happened. I couldn't always find an easy overlay, but a lot of times I was able to get folks close to, you know, what they were really interested in. And so that was my experience. And that was part of the reason why I was able to do that too, was because I spent so much time getting to know the students through the different activities related to the Bkbb project, even before we had that first initial conversation about where the exhibit would go. So, yeah.
Thank you. Stephanie, can you share a little bit about your exhibit topic? And maybe talk about that experience meeting with Sonia, and maybe share what collection items that you guys found together that compelled you to put your exhibit together.
Sure. My exhibit is entitled Keyword Abolition, Keyword Revolution. I believe I came across an image of James Pennington in the archives, and I don't remember if Sonia pointed me toward that, or if, I think in the beginning, a lot of the times she would pull stuff out to try to pull stuff out of us, which was really helpful. But just trying to remember, I think that's the first thing that I sort of engaged with when we started this project. And so I began looking into him first, and then learning through various archival materials how he freed himself from slavery in 1827 at 19 years old, and how his story sort of inspired me to then look at abolition and revolution in contrast with the sort of American Revolution story that we're all a little more familiar with, and settlers coming over to the United States. So just revealing more about his life through different types of documents, I started to just sort of feel his self-determination and his timeline and his story, and start to put a story in my mind together about him, and realize, oh, you know, also that you have to be really responsible with research and not put yourself onto these things as much as you might be imagining is okay or not. So that taught me a lot. Also with working with materials. And then that led me to then start trying to put keywords into Pearl, and how am I going to, you know, my biggest interest was talking about abolition and revolution against what's going on now, and how those words are used today with you know, like abolition of prisons, abolition of police, and revolutionary movements that are going on now. And so I wanted to merge these things together in some way. And Sonia definitely helped keep me in focus, as well as just working with other students, and also thinking about other students visiting this exhibit at some point and using the archives themselves, and thinking about my challenges and keeping those things in mind as I went through, and figuring out how to, you know, make Angela Davis and James Baldwin also in conversation with James Pennington and building my exhibit. Yeah, I think that basically, like, I'm just trying to think of like what else, like what items in the collection might have compelled me to focus on my exhibit on this topic. I think we also went through a lot more materials that we had to sort of disregard or put aside for future research, because everything was just so big. Like it was overwhelming how much you had access to. And so really with Sonia's help, I was like reined in to be like, look, we gotta focus here. And so that was like a big challenge for me in order, and the archivists and everything at PHS are what helped me learn how to like build something without going all over the place, basically. So yeah, and I think if people visit the exhibit in October, they can kind of see how figures like these can be put in dialogue with each other, and on the other hand, how their stories also speak to events of the past and present when it comes to abolition and revolutionary change in the present.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'll send a link in the chat just in a bit, a link to Stephanie's digital exhibit where you can experience her work. It's not quite as impressive as it is in person, but it's still very impressive. So you can all take a look at that and get a little more insight into the research she did. Sonia, I was wondering how the histories that you identified and helped students discover, how were they different from stories that PHS has shared in the past, or how were they similar?
That's a good question. I think what makes those stories different that were identified by the students, I think what makes them different is that the students came into this project without the benefit or the hindrance of being so focused on one particular way to look at history or at current events. And so their perspective was much more broad and much more unique and to their circumstances. In that I feel like the students, because they weren't necessarily trained historians or trained archivists, that gets you to look at the world in a certain way. And I think that because they had completely different perspectives on things, they brought that difference to their exhibits, and you can see it reflected in each one of the student exhibits. So for example, I think that in dealing with the social upheaval that was a huge part of 2020 and 2021, and that deeply influenced the students, it makes sense that archivists or historians or anyone who's kind of living and working in this time is going to want to talk about different themes that came up, like how we look at public monuments. Like that's something any archivist or historian might want to talk about, might want to design an exhibit around. But I think that, for example, with Maya's decision to completely block them and subvert the narrative of this is what history is in her exhibit and say, actually, I want to physically cover these statues up. I mean, that was all her idea. That was all her, decision about how I want to evoke a certain ideology, tell a certain story. And I think that it was different from necessarily what, what I would say. I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think it was different from where how I would have approached the statues and talking about the statues. And I really appreciated that. I think that was one of the most challenging things for me about working with the students, was kind of restraining my usual impulse to look at history in a certain way and to tell stories in a certain way, because I have a certain, type of viewpoint, certain type of training, and kind of restraining that and just saying, okay, what do you think? How do you want to tell this story? And how can I help you tell the story in the way that you want to tell it? And I was really glad that I was, able to do that as much as possible, and that it allowed me to learn from them just as much as I hope they were also learning from me. Yeah.
Holmen's exhibit. Do you just want to briefly describe that exhibit? And I'll link in chat the digital exhibit, but I think that's really an impressive exhibit, and one that, if you join us on October 6th, I think you'll get a full picture of what Sonia is talking about.
Sure. So it's much better if you can see it in person, or if you can just see what the exhibit looks like even online. But essentially, we have statues that are in front of our building here at the Presbyterian Historical Society that are representations of major figures in Presbyterian history. They are the folks that are recognized as like the founding fathers of Presbyterianism. And these statues represent these figures, but they are they harken back to an older perception of what it meant to be Presbyterian, and which is very old white male. And Maya, as an African-American woman, decided that, let's talk about a different kind of story, and let's think about who else is not being represented, who is also an integral part of the Presbyterian story and what it means to be Presbyterianism, what it means to be Presbyterian. And so in thinking about that, she decided that it was a good, she decided that she wanted to elevate in front of these classic figures. She wanted to elevate in front of them someone else. And she decided to focus on another Presbyterian, and that Presbyterian that she decided to focus on is Betty Dora. And the connection between Maya and Betty Dora is that Betty is a poet and Maya is a poet, and that link of poetry, I think it was the thing that really connected Maya to Betty's work. And I think that just having a different perception of what it means to be Presbyterian was the key link for Maya, and what was kind of a key thing about Maya's exhibit. So hopefully that explains it a little bit. If you look at it just visually, what you'll see is there are panels that represent each part or stanza of Betty's poem are placed in front of these 6 statues that we have in front of the building. And, you know, it just calls the attention to the poems and the story and the diverse story that those statues wouldn't tell. It's creating a whole different perception of what it means to be Presbyterian. Sure.
Very well. So yeah, I encourage you all to check the link or visit the Bkbb website and explore not only Stephanie and Maya's exhibits, but the exhibits of the other 5 panelists that we haven't mentioned here today, but who worked just as hard to get to dig into the archives and tell a new kind of story. My last question to wrap up today is for Stephanie. I was wondering, what are some of the challenges that you experienced during the project, and what were some of the successes?
Yeah, so I guess besides the pandemic completely disrupting our in-person collaborative process, the biggest challenge for me was really wrestling with how to disentangle all these new tensions I was experiencing with myself and this history that I was exploring, being confronted with, and just being in that building itself as a different kind of institution, having all these materials at my disposal, like I was saying earlier, and then having to choose between some materials and not others, trying to put that into words and visuals that would make sense to a student visiting the archive or anybody visiting. It was just really important to me, like we're putting ourselves out here as like professional exhibit designers, and you know, and also trying to figure out like how not to put a lot of pressure on myself so that my art or, you know, what I create doesn't suffer from that. So I think that was the biggest challenge for me in a lot of different ways. But as far as successes go, I think what Dr. Prejsnar was talking about earlier really hits home with like the way he articulated it was really my full experience. It expanded my critical thinking. It made me more articulate. It was just transformative in lots of different ways for me. I'm not as afraid or intimidated about going into different institutions. And I'm not as afraid or intimidated about giving public, you know, making sort of like presentations and stuff like that, putting myself out there, my ideas out there, because, you know, even though this was a student-led exhibit, part of the staff at PHS, how they were so supportive, how everyone was so supportive, is just like, don't be afraid to just, you know, make a claim, make your claim, what you're interested in, and, you know, the process is to, you know, stick with it and defend it. It's not like you're doing a major thesis here or anything, but I took it really seriously. And so, even though there were some lulls and everything in going through that process, also I think the thinking together with the group was also a big success. And on a professional level, being able to work with professional archivists and exhibit designers was also great exposure that helped me advance as a professional and an academic.
Thank you, Stephanie. That wraps up my questions for the panelists, but I wanted to leave a little bit of time for audience questions. Please feel free to type any questions you have in the Q&A or the chat. I see a link here or a question here from Pat. I will absolutely put those links that I mentioned in the chat, and I will also follow up with an email after the session that will include links to the Bkbb website and some of the other places we mentioned today. I have a question for Jenny. You mentioned, or you walked us through some of the digitized sources and the source sets that are on the Bkbb website. You focused in on the First Great Awakening. What are some of the other topics that were covered in those source sets?
Let's see, now I've gone completely blank. It's a pretty good range of things. We've got, let me go back here. Shall I share the screen again? Do we have time for that? Okay. Here we go. Share. Okay, so we'll go back to the source sets. And we can just skim through here. Missions to Native Americans, that was another one that we did with Dave's class. Rhetoric about slavery in the Revolutionary era. The American Revolution, which is sort of a different, it overlaps, but a little bit of a different take. This one, African American Clergy on Slavery, is a really interesting one. We have information from the Lane Seminary, Absalom Jones' Thanksgiving sermon, and speaking of Pennington, Christian Zeal. So these are sort of three different perspectives, three different takes. That is, Pennington is the minister that Stephanie mentioned. Let's see. Sorry, I should have all these all in the front of my mind. Women in the anti-slavery movement, I think, is the basic set that Stephanie used in the first class that she did with us here, where she sort of highlighted she highlighted something that wasn't actually what we were sort of laying the documents out for, but she found a different perspective on it to write about, which is exactly what we want the students to do. We want them to dig into these materials and find something that really speaks to them. And Stephanie did that. It's a great example of that. Temperance Colonization, which is, these documents are from around the 1830s. The colonization movement goes back a couple of decades before that. This is an interesting one because I have thought that this would be a really popular topic with students in a couple of different classes in African American history and in 19th century history. And students have not gravitated to this as much as I thought they would. I think it's a very problematic and full of complications. The story is really difficult to get a handle on, and that might be why students haven't sort of gone for this one as much as I thought they would. We have Black suffrage, in Pennsylvania in 1838, Bible riots, which has to do with disagreement between, Dave's going to have to jump in and help me out here, disagreements between Catholics and Protestants in Philadelphia at that period of time. So you can see, this is another one of my favorites, Presbyterian mission to the Chinese in California. That's a fairly different topic than a lot of the other ones. It's a little bit later and just the other side of the country. It's not, a lot of our topics have been a little more Philadelphia based. This one is distinctly not Philadelphia based, but an interesting story. And then some Civil War era collections as well. So people can scroll through the sets, or you can scroll through the individual sources in the source library and just take a peek. You can open up each document and see what it covers.
Thank you, Jenny. We have a question from Eleanor. She was wondering, it's a question for Dave. She was wondering if you could give some specific examples of the topics students came up with and their success in building papers around their research.
Okay, well, I think first of all, like Stephanie mentioned, and also Jenny, the students were often given a choice of maybe between 5 and 7 topics. So it would be great, and probably that would be the ideal if students could come up with their own topic. But I think one thing, even before I got involved, my colleague Joel Tannenbaum, I think the way he put it was, you have to kind of separate out the the research to pick a topic, and then the research to kind of answer a question in the topic. And sometimes, because of the length of the semester, it just felt overwhelming to students if you have them do both. And so I think by the time I became involved, they had already decided, and Jenny, you could chime in here if you want, that somehow it had to be limited a little bit more. That if you just gave students, let's say, go to the archives and start reading and see what you'd be interested in, it would probably be too much for the students. Having said that, and Sonia, you might know something about this. So one of the students who exhibited in the archive was Celia, one of my former students. And she ended up doing her, I believe, her exhibit on Presbyterian missionary activity in Japan. And that actually, Japanese history is really my main area, but that wasn't something we covered in class. So there's an example, and maybe you could say something about this, where she seems to have picked up on an idea that she hadn't thought of before. And Stephanie, I think you sort of alluded to this too in designing your exhibit. So somehow you had the skills to be able to decide what was the scope of the exhibit. So I don't know, Sonia, if you know how Celia came up with that, because that might answer the question Eleanor was asking.
Yeah, I think the connection, if I remember correctly, was that a friend of hers was studying at a university that was founded by a Presbyterian missionary, and that was the connection that she made. She said, "Oh, well, it'd be interesting to learn more about that particular topic." And I know from my end, it was kind of like, yes, we can definitely help you find out about missionaries. Missionaries, we can do. We've got a lot about missionaries. And so, she kind of built from there. But that was one of those instances where she kind of zeroed in on a particular theme. And I just said, yeah, all right, well, here's what we have that will help you kind of tell that story. Yeah.
Thank you. One last question from the audience to wrap up. It's for Sonia and Stephanie. McKenna was wondering if there's any topic that really stuck out to you, or if while you were digging in the archives, if there was like a source that you came across, a document that surprised you, and if you could share about that.
Stephanie, I don't know if you want to answer this question. It's kind of a hard one for me because I, am interacting with different objects constantly. So
mostly the beginning of the question was, I thought it was for you, but anyway, I'll answer from my perspective, my favorite source was really something that came from different Presbyterian churches all over the country, which was the system that the Presbyterian Church apparently created across all of the congregations, I guess, across the country, in order to respond to the Angela Davis, quote unquote controversy, and this like system, or as Sonia called it in the past when we were looking at these, there's like the Presbyterian Church like made up a rubric to sort of grade what every Presbyterian that they could get to answer this questionnaire would say about the Presbyterian Church giving $10,000 to Angela Davis's bail fund. And a lot of those questions were really telling about where white Presbyterians were at that time in the country, about this Black radical woman who was also a communist, how that framed her as basically, a criminal in the eyes of everyone. And just the way the questions were framed lent to that criminalization, I think, in a public way. So that was my favorite source, really. I mean, the most exciting thing to going through each of those documents. And then those led to discovering boxes of stuff about the Black Panthers, and then more and more. So, and then we got a delivery at the last minute of more of those questionnaires and more stuff about Angela Davis, just out of the blue. It was like all the stars aligned, and some random lady just popped by with another box. She had no idea that any of this was going on. So that was really crazy. And I think that was the most memorable for me.
And I'll just add in that finding that rubric was probably one of the most surprising things for me, because it just spoke to the volume of letters and correspondence that existed, that they had to come up with a specific rubric to, go through all of this correspondence. It speaks to the volume, to how much people were talking about this issue within the church and how much correspondence was going on. So that rubric in and of itself was one of the most interesting finds for me. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you both. I think that's all the questions that we have for today. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining and talking about the Bkbb project. It's one that we were all involved with and had so much fun doing, and we're so excited to continue working with CCP and bring classes in the fall and the spring. And we're so thankful for the support that we've had from Community College of Philadelphia and from Pew Center for Arts and Heritage to do this project. So I encourage you all to check out the Bkbb website. I'll drop it in the chat once more before we all sign off. And please, if you have any questions about the project or about the event on October 6th, you can reach out to anyone here at PHS and we'd be happy to answer your questions. So I will put that link in the chat once more and then sign off. So again, thank you, everyone. I'll give you a minute to grab that link, and take care. Have a good night. We'll see you at the next PHS Live.